So, to this evening's event, thank you so much, Dr. Palabıyık, for speaking to us this evening. I'm just going to give a little bit of background on you. Neil is a lecturer in medieval and early modern studies at Queen Mary University. Her research is at the crossroads of religious history, and manuscript and print culture, focusing on the interactions between the Ottoman Empire and Europe in the early modern period. She was a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the Rylands Library in Manchester and held visiting fellowships at the Scaliger Institute in Leiden and the Herzog-August Library in Wolfenbüttel. She worked at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich as a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and completed her habilitation in 2022. And she was named in 2023 the winner of the Liebling Prize. Neil will talk a little bit about her future work, so I'm going to skip to her strong belief that historical research unearthing lesser-known cultural and intellectual connections between Europe and the Islamic world is increasingly relevant in the current political climate defined by rising tensions between the West and the Middle East. Great time to have you here today.
Thank you very much to the organizers, to the Levantine Heritage Foundation, and to Royal Asiatic Society for inviting me to speak to you this evening and making this wonderful event possible. I'm deeply honored. My intention this evening is to take you on a journey across early modern Turkish learning and the impact of Ottoman scholarly practices, tastes and ideas on European literature, thought and university education. I will also share my own learning curve throughout the writing of my recent monograph, Silent Teachers. It was an eye-opening journey with many setbacks and some exciting discoveries. It has been more than a decade since I began working on Ottoman book culture and its influence over European scholarship, intellectual history, and Renaissance thought at large. Even before I begin a lecture, it remains an area that requires a good deal of demystification. So the first hurdle, when I always thought trying to get ideas across, is to go against the persistent idea that intellectual and scholarly interaction between the Ottoman Empire and Western Europe was minimal. I think we find it easier to grasp the immense impact of the Ottoman Empire on Europe in other areas, especially the military antagonism with the powerful and lasting image of marching Ottoman armies towards Europe. In popular historiography of the past 3 centuries, this multifaceted civilization is seen as a threat rather than an asset for the West. Some historians deviated from this prescribed form and focused on the more neutral aspects of this mutual interaction, namely trade ties, commercial agreements, and diplomatic relations, all of which proliferated in the 16th and 17th centuries. This was a connected world. People traveled more than ever before. Many Europeans visited the Ottoman Empire. And some of these travelers were talented artists who could produce impressive works, such as this panorama. The Danish artist Melchior Lorck created the prospect of Constantinople in 1559 while resident in the Ottoman Empire as part of the embassy of Archduke Ferdinand I. This drawing is an accurate and faithful representation of the cityscape of the Ottoman capital. Yet it is not a soulless topography. In fact, I would argue that it is a vivid and animated snapshot of a lived moment. Giving real credit to the multi-layered history and the rich culture of the city, Lorck's Constantinople features ancient monuments bearing testimony to its Roman past and grand mosques with large crowds chanting the daily prayers in pious whispers. Beautiful boats with white sails flutter across the Golden Horn. Diplomats came here to secure trade agreements and political alliances. Merchants came to buy and sell goods. Collectors came to smuggle out artifacts, plants, seeds, fossils, rocks and minerals. Some came to measure ancient monuments, purchase manuscripts, and to learn languages. Others aspired to spreading Christianity among Muslims and settled on bringing Eastern Christianities into the Catholic or the Protestant fold. Istanbul was the most populous and economically active place on earth at the time. Everyone wanted a piece of that pie. Lord even included himself in the bungalow. He's seen here, accompanied by a Turkish man in a turban, taking in this magnificent view from Galata, the neighborhood where the European ambassadors, merchants, and visitors resided. And this was an increasingly global world. University education followed that trend. Now we will look at an image that hardly screams cultural influence of the Ottoman Empire at first sight. This is as Western European as it gets, right? Protestant Dutchmen with their pointy hats in the library. This engraving comes from a series of 4 promotional posters advertising the educational offerings of Leiden University. The other engravings depicted the operation theatre, the botanical gardens, and the sports hall. You might ask why a university needed to advertise the public of its education and facilities. Founded in 1575, it was a relatively new institution. Leiden University claimed to be the new Academy of Athens, the intellectual powerhouse of the young and ambitious Dutch Republic. And today its engraving is often conjured up to discuss how Europeans classified and organized knowledge in the early modern era. A pre-Enlightenment sketch of scientific learning, what Renaissance scholarship is often associated with, the accumulation of information in neat boxes, just as they would be in a cabinet of curiosities, for instance. The birth of a modern, enlightened, scientific Europe. But this image is not about it at all. It is Leiden University's advertising of its accumulation of Oriental knowledge and its close ties to the Ottoman Empire and East India. The engraving shows key symbols to make a number of points. So you see printed books in shelves organized by subject, theology, law, mathematics, medicine, history, etc. 4 globes showing the 4 corners of the world that the young man who would attend should aspire to visit, govern, or negotiate with. And as you can see, they have these really cute oily couples of them. But where are the missing pieces in this history? One missing item is arguably the largest one in the room. It's almost 12 meters long, and it's on the right-hand side of the image. You see a panorama of a city. It's a huge painting depicting the city-state of Constantinople. I have already shown you a breathtaking detail from it, and this is the rest of it, or only the eight pieces out of the 21 that I could fit into a single slide. Why would an image of Constantinople, the capital of a predominantly Islamic empire, feature so prominently in this library? Leiden University acquired Melchior Lord's impressive scroll in 1590 to adorn one of its walls. The purchase was Janus Husa, the university's first librarian, who published an account of his own visit to Constantinople at the end of the century. So the maker visited Constantinople and the purchaser too. It seems anybody who was somebody wanted to visit this place. The panorama would indicate to the prospective students that they could read books from the Ottoman Empire in Leiden and perhaps one day visit the city themselves. how history is erased piece by piece. Once the room's most eye-catching feature, this panorama was subsequently relegated to a dusty loft, only to be rediscovered in the 19th century. By that time, its original location was forgotten, the scroll badly damaged, and cut into 21 sheets for easy storage. The drawing has recently been digitally reconstructed and made publicly available by my University Online. But that's not all. There's also this cabinet to the right-hand side. And it houses the Hebrew, Arabic, Turkish, and Persian manuscripts, mainly from the Ottoman Empire, that once belonged to Joseph Scaliger, a celebrated humanist and the most famous professor of this institution. Scaliger was one of the first scholars in Protestant Europe to understand the importance of learning Turkish. He never traveled to the East, but acquired manuscripts to study the languages. He made some progress with Arabic, but not enough with Turkish. He wrote about his frustration of not finding a suitable teacher and complained about lack of good reference works. It is true that a scarcity of books and experts marked the early decades of Oriental studies in Western Europe. Manuscripts needed to be sought, found, bought, and brought to Europe. Then there was the even more difficult business of deciphering them. On 15th of October 1607, a frustrated Scaliger wrote from Leiden to Etienne Hiver in Paris, complaining about his Turkish manuscripts. Scaliger was a fine linguist who mastered Latin and Greek in his childhood, by the age of 5, and Hebrew in his teens. But he struggled in his old age to decipher the Turkish explanations for Arabic and Persian words supplied in his Ottoman dictionaries. These books, I quote, are written in the most elegant and distinguished way, he explained to Hiver, a physician and an Orientalist scholar whom Scaliger never met in person, but grew very close to towards the end of his life. Yet, despite his best efforts, Scaliger could not understand even the foreword to one of his dictionaries, the Arabic-Turkish one, on the right-hand side, as if, and I quote, as if it were written in Gaelic or Finnish. Concluding that books from the Islamic world needed to be explained orally, viva voce, Scaliger termed his books, his Turkish books, silent teachers, multimagistri. My recent monograph, entitled Silent Teachers, after Scaliger's observation, gives voice to the now obscure Turkish books in European libraries and tells a story of curiosity and cooperation, as well as confusion and conflict. In the next 40 minutes or so, I will try to share some of the insights from this book. During the 1600s, centers for learning in Europe increasingly took on the role of teaching Oriental languages at the university level. I only mentioned Leiden so far, but these centers included Rome, Vienna, Paris, and German university towns such as Tübingen and Augsburg, and to some extent Oxford and Cambridge. These cities and institutions, and the scholars who worked in them, required a substantial number of Turkish and multilingual, often Turkish together with Arabic and Persian, but also Hebrew Turkish, Greek Turkish, Armenian Turkish, Italian Turkish manuscripts. They read and studied a wide range of texts, including history, geography, astronomy, philosophy, mathematics, as well as poetry, letter writing manuals, and folk texts. Practical texts such as those on herbal remedies, horticulture, dream interpretation, and geomancy were studied. And once they were able to read and study them, European scholars also produced works that explained Turkish texts, taught Turkish, or brought ideas and information found in Turkish books into Europe. These included dictionaries, grammars, translations of scientific, theological, and literary texts, and others. But then, if these cross-pollinations occurred, why do we know almost nothing about early modern scholarly exchanges between Ottomans and their European counterparts? Here comes the double bias. I will argue that a twofold bias arrested the development of historiography of Turkish learning in Europe. The presumption that after the invention of the printing press, all essential textual materials were printed, and that we can write the history of Turkish learning in Europe by examining printed works really slowed down our understanding. And then there's a misconception that Turkish was an unimportant language compared to Arabic, or that the Ottomans were a non-literate culture, that scholars in Europe never bothered to learn Turkish. Let's start with the first one, printed books in Turkish. There are a few, and those that were produced were of dubious quality, both in workmanship and in editing. Ottomans wrote Turkish mainly in the Arabic script, with special characters borrowed from Persian and diacritics to indicate vowels. Reproducing this cursive script in print was laborious and expensive. The first Arabic types were cut in Rome, and they were crude, and the cost of production could not be justified by the sluggish sales. Muslim readers were not impressed with the quality, and there were not enough European readers to create a mass demand. Therefore, very few Arabic, Turkish, and Persian works produced in Europe went through the press. If we only consider printed books, we will end up with a very limited sample to make any meaningful assumptions. Manuscripts are difficult to access and more difficult to read, as you will see later on. Some scholars completely disregarded them. So back to the early modern production of books such as these. If Arabic type was tricky, but then there was a cheaper option to print Turkish in Latin characters. Some books were produced in this way, especially if they were meant for the lay people instead of erudite readers. And one such book is Bartolomeo Georgievich's Captivity Narrative. This is a book that allegedly reports the observations of a Christian enslaved by the Ottomans who spent several years in Asia Minor. Georgievich comments on the customs of Turks, from evolutions to circumcision to their diet and education. The tone of this book is exclusive. The reported information oscillates between contempt and admiration, but either way, it aims to incite one action only: a Europe-wide military campaign against the Ottoman Empire to end Christian enslavement and the progress of Ottomans towards Europe. The readers are expected to feel anger against the Turk and pity towards their perceived victims. They are also to be ashamed by any achievement that these barbarians inexplicably managed to attain, and rise to the occasion and take up arms. It is quite the early modern version of today's extremist content. Yet somehow, all the customs and religious ceremonies of the Turks, this book has so far been perceived as an important work of ethnographic knowledge. From the imagery of the book, you can tell that it is very religiously, it is very focused on Christian ideas. Christian call to arms. This book has also been included in many surveys on Turkish learning in Europe. This is because the fourth and final chapter, entitled On the Vocabulary, Reading and Numbers, provides a thematically arranged word list of about 200 nouns, adjectives, and verbs in Turkish. The source of this list is unclear, but other parts of the book reveal that the self-proclaimed expert Georgievich knew very little Turkish. The later expanded editions of the book, for instance this one published in Rome, became a bit more religiously focused and included a translation of the Lord's Prayer into Turkish, a text presumably produced to aid the Catholic missionaries going to the Ottoman Empire. Guillaume Postel, a serious French scholar, Visionary for Universal Christianity, published a similar book on Turkish customs in 1575. Postel was well-versed in Arabic, and he tried to learn Turkish as well in Constantinople with a tutor, but he doesn't seem to have progressed much. And he published exactly the same material. This book contained the same Turkish word list and the Lord's Prayer, this time translated into French instead of Latin, casting doubt on the origins of these translations. These texts were possibly in manuscript circulation, widely distributed prior to the printing of these editions. It is also possible that they were included by the editors rather than the authors themselves to mark up these volumes. But not all printed works about Turkey or containing Turkish were cheaply produced popular literature in small book formats. There were also serious folios. Here we have a handsome folio, a lavishly printed work based on original Turkish manuscripts. The German humanist scholar Johann Claudius traveled to Constantinople in 1584 as part of the diplomatic delegation accompanying the imperial ambassador Heinrich von Liechtenstein. Although not sufficiently fluent in Turkish himself, Claudius was helped by a local language expert, and he was thus able to compose the annals of the Ottoman sultans written by Turks in their language, and this book that you see on the slide, The Muslim History of the Turks, based on their own sources, in 18 books. Claudius sat down with the now employed Ottoman court interpreter Murat Bey, who had fallen from favor due to his drinking habit, and translated 3 Ottoman manuscripts into Latin during his stay. These translations culminated in the impressive and informative histories of the Ottoman dynasty, as well as the long glossaries that explain the Turkish terms found in the translated text. Scaliger, the owner of the contents of the cabinet in the first engraving that I have shown at the Leiden University Library, the famous scholar who lamented that he could not read Turkish, in fact studied this book intently and learned some of the words and phrases, learned some words and phrases from it, often with the help of Greek and Hebrew. One has to admit though, however learned and comprehensive, these Latin language Ottoman histories had limited use for learning and teaching Turkish. Perhaps one needed a good grammar of Turkish, and this is when a charlatan and a fraud rose to the occasion. When Scaliger began studying Turkish in the last decade of the 16th century, there was not a single printed grammar available. In 1612, a German linguist named Hieronymus Giza issued the Principles of the Turkish Language in 4 books. According to oft-quoted experts, this was the first full-fledged Turkish grammar to be published in Europe, and it represented a landmark in Turkish studies. In reality, the Giza's Principles was nothing more than a half-plagiarized, half-recycled publication with little merit. Utterly astounding is the story of how this volume was produced and distributed, and how it was studied by early modern Orientalists who set out to expose the Giza's fraud and incompetence, but failed. Here you see his annotations on the copy that he owned. But since then, this minor publication undeservedly occupied a prominent place in the historiography of early modern Turkish studies. The arresting episode involving theft, academic rivalry, and a sour friendship unfolded as follows. An Austrian nobleman by the name of Hector von Arnau traveled to Constantinople in 1584 in diplomatic service and stayed there for 6 years. He learned some Turkish and composed a Turkish grammar there, which he sent to an acquaintance, the German linguist, historian, and court laureate, Hieronymus Giza. Megiza had previously published polyglot books with textual examples in 40, 50 languages and a dictionary of 400 languages, including Turkish. This polyglot material was often of poor quality and entirely compiled from other printed and manuscript sources. Moreover, Megiza's most famous book, the Oriental Chronicles, a local history that was commissioned to write by the Palabıyık region, was also plagiarized. So you see a pattern here that somebody was very keen to pass on other people's work. It says, it therefore comes as no surprise that Megiza spotted an opportunity here and took it. He could simply pass on for Ernal's grammar as his own and then add the Turkish sections from his polyglot books to bulk up the volume. There was only one fly in the ointment. He knew from Ernal personally, and the latter asked them simply to print his grammar, not to publish it under his own name. Even to this conundrum, Megiza found a solution. And that is in the middle of the slide here. He would print the book privately in Leipzig, except for book 1, which required Arabic characters, as you see in book 1 here. And for this part, he would request the help of a friend, the Breslav physician and Orientalist Peter Kirsten, who owned Arabic type and who had published his own Arabic grammar. Then he would print an extra dedication to Paul Ernal, in the middle, and in this dedication, he freely acknowledges that the latter is the author of the grammar, and then add this dedication to only a few copies intended for the real author, and distribute the rest without it. Since the print run was small and Paul Ernal safely away in Carinthia, the trick worked. Or did it? One reader, the German veterinarian and Orientalist Johann Melchior Mahler, eventually found out. Mahler came across one of the few copies Megiza sent to Paul Ernal. This unique copy included the dedicatory poem acknowledging his authorship of the grammar, while the other copies Mahler had seen did not. Mahler was flabbergasted that Megiza had the cheek to pass on the entire book as his own. Having noticed the excessive number of errors in the last 2 books of the Principles, Mahler began preparing a corrected copy for the print, a project which remained unfinished because Mahler died in the 30 Years' War. Therefore, even a new article in the latest Encyclopedia of Islam 3, published in July 2021, precisely 400 years after Mahler's expose, and he was so angry that he wrote here and explained that, oh, this is Hector von Ernal's book, not Megiza's, etc., but all the title pages long, he crossed over autore and put descriptore. He was so angry with what was happening. So even 400 years after this happening, the Encyclopedia of Islam still celebrates Megiza as having written the first systematic grammar and dictionary of Turkish ever published in print. And many other scholars, of course, followed suit and established the misguided view that Turkish studies in Europe began in earnest with Megiza, with this publication by particularly a charlatan who had no Turkish. So the first 2 chapters of the Principles were taken from von Ernal's manuscript with added errors by Megiza, and the final 2 books were compiled from Megiza's previous polyglot publications. So similar to these word lists and chrestomatries that I've shown that appeared in Georgievich and Oskan's publications. So there was a body of manuscript Turkish chrestomatries that were in circulation, and they were, again, dubious quality. Whereas the content and the quality of the first half is consistent with the Arabic grammars of the early 17th century, the latter half is full of errors, as Mahler's corrections show. So I have a clean copy here, but he made many corrections to his own copy. So this is another false card in our imperfect deck of printed Turkish books. If the first printed Turkish grammar was of dubious authorship and quality, what about the second one? Given that Megiza's Turkish grammar was plagiarized and self-published, we have to accept that the French Orientalist André Durier, as the author of the first European Turkish grammar that had commercial value and garnered a readership beyond the author's close circle of friends. Durier's Basics of the Grammar of the Turkish Language came out in 1630 in two different formats, a smaller one and a larger one, and then it went into a second issue in 1633, which shows that it was significantly more popular, more widely available than Megiza's work. And it was welcomed by the international community of Oriental scholars. Durier learned Turkish while in diplomatic service. I think now we are seeing a pattern here. He was in Aleppo, Alexandria, and Constantinople. And he was a competent Orientalist who was even hired by the Sultan for a mission to France. Durier collected many manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, and now they are at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And he gave us the first translation of the Quran into vernacular, into French, and produced a partial translation of Sa'di's Kurdistan. So both could work both with Arabic and Persian. And he compiled a decent Turkish dictionary, which remained in manuscript. And he also published this grammar, which unfortunately suffered from persistent grammatical errors. On the one hand, Durier comes across as a proficient user of Turkish, in fact an expert in composing texts, such as the Turkish translation of the harangue, a speech carrying messages of friendship and cooperation from the French king, which was reportedly read during an audience with the Sultan. He also translated the Psalms into Turkish, which is a decent translation, not the best, but he is a competent Orientalist. And although not immune to the occasional spelling error, the Turkish text of harangue, for instance, is written by an advanced user of Ottoman Turkish who received formal training, both in calligraphy and composition. On the other hand, when we look at this printed source, Durier's printed grammar contains numerous basic errors that an advanced user would not commit. Most notably, the disregard for vowel harmony, an essential feature of Turkish grammar. In the printed edition, the verbs sevmek, to love, and içmek, to drink, pişmek, to cook, are repeatedly spelled with a kaf instead of kef. A blatant error such as this should have raised some eyebrows, but Durier's contemporaries seem to have completely overlooked it. Interestingly enough, similar errors are not extant in the manuscript dictionary or the speech Durier presented for the ambassador, prepared for the ambassador, and presented to the Sultan. Therefore, I suspect that the printed works were not necessarily, these errors were probably introduced by the printers themselves, not by the author or the editors. And then there is a growing suspicion here that printed works are not necessarily indicative of the level of Turkish knowledge in Europe. One man's manuscripts are showing a more advanced knowledge of Turkish and his grammar is full of errors like this, then there is some kind of problem here. But to be honest, by this point I was pretty demoralized about the fate of Turkish studies in Europe. Was this the extent of Turkish studies? In Western Europe, primitive word lists, 2 poor grammars, and a handful of dictionaries, some Latin translations of Ottoman chronicles made by an inebriated Ottoman court interpreter. I almost accepted the ideologically driven conclusions of the historians of the past 50 years. I'm referring to our second bias, that Ottoman Empire was the land of no books, despite knowing full well about the famous book markets of Constantinople, Bursa, Aleppo, Damascus, and Cairo. And that anybody who considered themselves a literally fine would write in Arabic or compose Persian poetry. Therefore, no European scholar ever bothered with Turkish, but aspired only to learn Arabic, despite knowing that this idea was a common trope of Ottoman courtly writing, which was repeated by European scholars because they read it there. What about the sciences, philosophy, prose literature, poetry? Where are they? Had nobody studied these vast sources? Where was the evidence? At this point, I put printed sources aside and focused solely on manuscripts. I scout hundreds of annotated Turkish manuscripts in Europe, examined the notebooks of famous Orientalists and less famous ones. My extensive study of these sources revealed a completely different picture. Oriental studies in early modern Europe developed in this manner, according to my findings. The learning of Arabic, Persian, and Turkish was modeled entirely on Ottoman methods, practices, and reference works. The trilingual madrasa education was adopted, the Ottoman textbooks and reference works were used extensively, and Turkish commentaries guided the reading of key texts. Moreover, Turkish literary works, both highbrow court poetry and less stuffy folk tales, were read with joy and curiosity. An English chaplain had even recorded the Sufi legends he had heard being recited in a dervish lodge in Constantinople. The first breakthrough came in Munich, one of the most unlikely places to find Turkish manuscripts. This is Anton Doizing, who has been a relatively unknown figure in Oriental studies until recently. He first learned Arabic to read medical texts, he was a physician, and then he moved to Persian to read the New Testament, the New Testament in Persian, and he also learned Turkish for reasons unknown. Yet he, under the guidance of his teacher, Jacobus Boyus, produced the richest Turkish dictionaries of early 17th century. And they were produced entirely from Ottoman sources. Dictionaries that were collected in Aleppo and Constantinople by Boyus for his private library and the library of Leiden University. This is his work, a trilingual dictionary comprising approximately 18,000 headwords in Turkish with Persian equivalents and Latin explication. And the main sources that were used in the compilation of this dictionary are the same ones that were studied in colleges across the Ottoman Empire. The Lugat-ı Metullah, the 16th century Persian-Turkish dictionary, and Dagestan and Uyghur and others that were recommended by Ottoman scholars to Europeans for the study of Turkish. He even produced another dictionary. This one is only Turkish into Latin, which presumably made the reading of texts quicker. And this one also has 17,000 entries, far richer than any other source from early 17th century on Turkish. And some of you in this room might have heard about Kaninsky and his famous printed dictionary from 1680s, printed in Vienna. Kaninsky has so far been known as the compiler of the most comprehensive Oriental dictionary of his age, and the first reliable dictionary of Ottoman Turkish. I still use it from time to time. This printed dictionary, published later in Vienna in the 1680s, is much more famous, but in fact, its contents are very similar to that of Doizing's, which was compiled in 1623. So, and it also depends mostly on the same sources that Doizing used, mainly Ahteri, an Arabic Turkish dictionary, and Nimetullah of Safiya's Persian Turkish dictionary, both popular in the 16th century as reference works used in schools and colleges. Goy's Anton Goizin's teacher in Leiden. He was a professor of mathematics, but then he was also appointed to the professorship of Oriental languages. And he lived his life in a bit of a reverse order. He first got the professorship in 1625, having no competence in any of the languages of the East. But at least he knew he needed to learn them and collect books. So after he was appointed, he went to Aleppo and Constantinople. He immediately joined the Dutch consul there to serve as his secretary. And he stayed for 18 months, learned Arabic, and collected many manuscripts through his local contacts. And towards the end of his career, he wrote this very famous, compiled this very famous lexicon of Arabic. And it is one of the rare, serious, scholarly, comprehensive works that actually went to print in Europe in the Arabic time. When Goyis moved to Constantinople, he started learning Turkish and Persian there and continued to collect manuscripts, building up the Leiden University Oriental book collection of over 200 volumes and even a bigger private library for himself, which is now part of the Marsh collection in Oxford. Goyis' study notes and his manuscript collection merit consideration together here to offer a fuller idea of his collecting and the way his library and his scholarship intertwine. Goyis collected read and annotated histories, such as Hoca Saadettin's famous chronicle, Crown Histories, that you see on the right here, and even a horticultural treatise. And this had a practical use for him because he was also responsible for the botanical gardens, to add new plants to the botanical gardens of Leiden. And this is one of the most famous Ottoman works on gardening, Bibnat Busta. And he read it and annotated it. And he read other works, geographies, musicologies, even philosophy, sciences, and music. He was interested in all these subjects, from dream interpretation to herbal remedies, and extracted a lot of information from Turkish sources. But then begs the question, was Turkish just a language of utility? To learn history, to learn gardening, to learn sciences. Was there any pleasure to be found in verses? Here we find Goyis reading Taşlı Yahya Bey's The King and the Beggar Shahi Geda. Goyis owned two copies of the 16th century Ottoman poet Yahya Bey's The King and the Beggar, a long narrative poem about unrequired love set in contemporary Constantinople. He annotated one copy heavily and turned the other recension with additional verses when his primary text lacked them. Was he trying to establish an authoritative version of the poem? Was he reminiscing about his time in the city, taking in all the detailed descriptions of the monuments, gardens, views, scents, sounds that were provided by the author? Or was he captivated by the main character, the elusive, reckless, and cruel beloved, who left a string of heartbroken male lovers behind? Show you what this poem looks like. I will share my crude translation of a few verses. He would say, "O vulgar fool, you have no right to wear this rose-colored garment. Does the red and lily resemble the rose? They only have one God in common. Do not come here and then go again. Do not cause my heart to rejoice and then despair." This is our the speaker of the poem talking, of course. And then the cruel beloved comes in again. "To the rose garden of the world, you're like a raven. Go at once, have your garment dyed black." And then it's our speaker again. "The cup of love would make him completely drunk. He would rebuke people. in this manner. And let's see how Boyus tackled this text. Boyus used a three-pronged methodology when translating the difficult Turkish verses into Latin. Sometimes he transliterated the Turkish words to figure out their oral quality, to find out what they sounded like, and these are marked with red on the page. For instance, he vocalized Numani next to Numan, Anemone, Birdahi next to Dahim, again, Ureum next to Ureum, my heart, and Boyad next to Boyad, Adek, Tinted. At other times, he made verbatim translations, and these are marked with blue in the slide. So we have Tanrısı, it's God. They use Avis, Gurab, Raven, which he translated as Corvus into Latin, and so on. Oftentimes, the words became more complicated and difficult to decipher, with puns, figures of speech, similes, and metaphors. And here, Boyus explicated the text in Latin with additional information, and these are marked in green. As in the case of Siyah Boyar, headed by black, where Boyus says, Timye Negro Corvus, all hemistichs were dyed black as a raven in order to clarify the metaphor. He rendered false hemistichs where they were particularly challenging. Hemistich 1935b is translated, for instance, as one believes in the one God of each of them, thus clarifying that the rose and the anemone are utterly dissimilar. They have only one thing in common, their acknowledgement that there is only one God. It should suffice by this point to say Boyus and other Orientalists spent a significant amount of time and effort to read Turkish. All these endeavors, from traveling to the East, collecting manuscripts, reading them, studying texts, and producing scholarly annotations and translations, paid off. Some of these scholars made great strides in learning the language, understanding the culture, even reading its literature. We have now moved from a frustrated Scaliger in 1607 who complained that he didn't have enough reference books and access to teachers, and consequently could not understand manuscripts, to 1640s, where we find only 2 generations down among Latin professors a competent Boyus, equipped with enough manuscript sources, local teachers, and Turkish Latin reference works. Remember the dictionaries compiled for this student, where you can read Taşlıcalı Yahya-based poetry with a masterful command of the language, as well as literary devices, idioms, and other figures of speech. And it wasn't only the Bible chords poetry that the Orientalists read. Other genres, such as post-folk tales and Sufi legends, were embraced. One Latin printer even entertained the idea of publishing some holy Nasreddin Hoca tales, associated with the whimsical hero Nasreddin Hoca, and for the uninitiated, he's a folk philosopher, often depicted as the town imam or judge, who rides his donkey backwards and dispenses wisdom of a different order than the usual mullah. Always armed with a punchline, disarming the silly comeback, or an endearingly practical solution to the folk's problems, the original Hoca tales contained in early Ottoman manuscripts were unashamedly lewd and full of profanity. So much so that our Dutch scholar had a difficult time bringing himself together to produce an acceptable Latin translation of this text, and left the project unfinished. Justus Raphelengus, poet, botanist, printer, publisher, was in Constantinople around 1600, where he learned Turkish, collected Oriental manuscripts, and bought this one. Now at Oxford Bodleian Library, this manuscript is a collection of 67 Turkish folk tales associated with the famous jester Nasreddin Hoca. As part of his learning journey, Raphaelengus translated the entire text into Latin. His interlinear translation reveals a lot about the working practices of a 17th century translator and publisher. Raphaelengus's tentative title, the Turkish Oyuncuları, his chosen tales, and the explanatory notes accompanying them demonstrates his vision for a bilingual Turkish-Latin literary edition, which would have been the first of its kind in Western Europe. The manuscript also reveals how European scholars collaborated with local teachers during their stays in the Ottoman Empire. Here on the upper right of the page, you see three summaries. You see the three summaries here. The close-up of the first one. In Italian, the lingua franca of the non-Muslim parts of the Ottoman capital, such as Ankara and Pera. Apparently, Raphaelengus sat down together with a Turkish teacher who explained the text. After a few pages, our printer no longer needed this crutch, or maybe lost his teacher, and the Italian summaries disappear. But the Latin interlinear translation continues throughout the text, only ceasing halfway through some of the tales that Raphaelengus deemed unpublishable due to their graphic content. The final figure I will introduce you to this evening is Edward Pope, the first Laudian professor of Arabic at Oxford. Pocock's career as an Orientalist followed a very similar path to that of Polius. He was a chaplain in the British diplomatic service to the Ottoman Empire and had extended stays in Aleppo and Constantinople. He collected Arabic, Persian, and Turkish manuscripts and sought the help of tutors to master these languages. The main difference between the two figures is that Polius was a professor of mathematics before he began the study of Middle Eastern languages, and Pocock was a theologian. Pocock's advanced knowledge of Arabic is well established, but his engagement with Turkish is still uncharted territory. And this is what I have started working on. This is actually work in progress. So his interest in religion in general and in Islam in its various mystical dimensions led Pocock to seek Sufi texts in Turkey. A number of these, including a Tübetname, a chivalry manual, and a fable penned by the celebrated Ottoman poet Lami Çelebi, containing a philosophical discussion between animals and men, entered his library. There is, however, an oblong notebook in Pocock's hand, today in Oxford's Bodleian Library, which is as unassuming and curious as it gets. Yet it shows us a very interesting chapter and an hitherto unstudied interaction between a European scholar and Ottoman dervishes. There are recorded visits to dervish lodges by European travelers to be entertained with music, and we find these in learned travelers' accounts such as that of Nicolas Toulouse and John Cobble. But Pocock's notebook is the first one to record the reciting of a popular Sufi book. Again, Lami Çelebi's The Book of Examples, Tübetname. And it seems Pocock made a friend at the dervish lodge and asked the Turkish man to show him an easy way of acquiring the language. Benim sultanım, benim muradım Türkçeyi öğrenmektir. Lütf ve ihsan edip ne tarih yapışayım ki bize kolay ola, bize dil versin. Could you tell me how to learn Turkish the easy way? And perhaps the teacher's answer was this text. The Book of Examples contains tales of miracles and wars involving Sufi sheikhs known for their great kindness and profound wisdom. These stories have been passed down through centuries across the Islamic world. The work guided its readers, mainly the brothers of various Islamic orders in the Ottoman Empire, in cities, towns, and so on, in religious mystical matters, state administration, and ethics. In Istanbul, Pocock acquired a copy of the Book of Examples, and he transcribed the first 5 legends from this collection into his notebook using Latin script with copious notes explaining the grammar, the vocabulary, and providing an interlinear translation of the passages. The first tale here in this page concerns an episode reported by the Kadiri Sheikh Abdullah Yafi. This event allegedly took place between the judge of Mosul, Mosul, a sly and cunning man, and the 12th century Iraqi Sheikh Qazı Boba. The judge schemes against the Sheikh. However, as they approach each other on the street, the Sheikh shapeshifts, he changes into another man. Ultimately, the judge realizes Qazı Boba's holiness transcends his own intelligence and power, leading him to repent for his cunning ways. Townsfolk are left amazed and confused by this encounter. They ask Yafi, how is it possible for Qazı Boba to possess such mystical powers, especially since he does not observe the daily prayers, namaz. Yafi explains that the Sheikh worships at the gates of Kaaba and he is capable of performing miracles. He doesn't have to do the daily prayers. So Pocock included interlinear translations within the text and provided a Turkish Latin glossary, that is on the right-hand side, on the adjacent pages. This glossary, unlike Holius's, primarily focuses on explaining verbs in various forms, which may have been one of the most challenging aspects of learning Turkish for Pocock, as he knew Hebrew and Arabic very well before starting on Turkish, and as you well know, Turkish significantly differs both from Semitic languages and also from Indo-European languages in the structure of its works. So that's that. Some concluding remarks, and we'll be on. So what all of these documents, all of these manuscripts, all of these printed works tell us are these main points, in my opinion. That there was a range of expertise among the so-called Orientalists, from those who studied just a little bit of Turkish and wrote travel narratives, to competent linguists such as Goizing, Holius, Patelendis, and Pocock, who would translate advanced texts. Printed sources are not a good indicator of knowledge or interest in Eastern languages. Technical difficulties and cost of printing in Arabic type, among other economic and cultural circumstances, skewed the scales towards manuscript production. Even in the late 17th century, an era that we often associate with printing. Ottoman Turkish sources were more influential than previously thought, especially in providing Europeans access to key texts. Reference tools such as commentaries, dictionaries, and grammars circulated. Christian theologians who turned Hebraists in this period, adding a third language to their arsenal after Latin and Greek, found that their trilingual education was mirrored in the Ottoman Empire's Efsane Selassie, the 3 languages, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, in madrasa and college education of the Islamic elite. So the European elite learned Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, and the Ottoman elite learned the 3 languages. What the Orientalists was interested in was not just biblical study or refutation of the Quran, that is religious wars, diplomatic correspondence, or military interest in the Turkish language, but there were meaningful engagements with literature, including secular and divine poetry, philosophy, and heterodox Islamic theology, including Sufi texts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Neil. That's That's an excellent talk. Thank you. Now, do we have any questions? Who would like to lead?
Thank you. That was an absolutely brilliant talk. Absolutely fascinating about the ways that you showed how Ottoman scholars were schooling their European counterparts in various aspects of language. I'm thinking more on the more elevated range of the Oriental state you were looking at. I was curious as to whether you also see the effect of Ottoman scholarship on the very structure of the type of lexicons that were being constructed. So were lexicons and grammars taking on Ottoman forms of knowledge, Ottoman methodologies of, I mean, I think you explained, at one point you explained that they were, he asked about, what's the easiest way of learning Turkish, and I was wondering whether those sorts of, whether the engagement with the Ottoman scholars was not just providing information about the language, but also was implicating new forms of inquiry and methodologies that European scholars were then incorporating into their own arsenal and battery of tools of analysis. So I'm wondering whether you were beginning to see actually even a more profound effect of Ottoman scholarship on European scholarships, and so that the lexicons and the grammars that were being developed were reflecting a sense of presuppositions that existed initially in the Ottoman world and in the Middle East, and then informed European practice. I asked the question because the assumption is generally the opposite. It's that, and so I'm wondering whether you're trying to turn, ultimately wanting to turn the tables on how knowledge systems and epistemologies traveled during this period, and that there was a much greater role for the Ottoman world in shaping the ways in which Europeans thought more broadly.
Thank you very much for this wide question. I will try to answer it more generally first, and then I will go into more detail about the use of dictionaries and how Europeans compiled their own dictionaries, their own Turkish dictionaries from alternate sources. So the question that Popok asks wasn't an unusual one. It was asked many times by other European travelers. It was once asked by a French diplomat and ambassador, and actually the Ottoman Imperial wrote a treatise on which sources were the best for learning Turkish as a foreign speaker, as a foreign language. And there he included a number of dictionaries, for instance, which only gives the Arabic words and the Turkish translations, words that occur in the Quran. And then there's one for reading Rumi's works, Persian Tufay Shahidi, the gift of Shahidi, which only gives the words that are found in the couplets of Rumi. And these were textbooks that were read in schools, and this is how Ottoman children, how Turkish-speaking Ottoman children in Albania, in Bosnia, in Bursa, elsewhere learned these languages. So there was a list of recommendations of sources, and they were religiously followed by Europeans. They collected these particular dictionaries, they collected these particular works that were, this treatise is called Kevar Kibi Seba, in 7 stars. So there is that precedence of asking for guidance and following it through. And we see exactly the same dictionaries, for instance, in Deuisen's list of sources, in Boyce's list of sources, in Belinsky's list of sources, etc., etc. So there was that influence. But then there were practical difficulties, especially with the organization of dictionaries. If the dictionaries were organized by the last letter of a word, that European scholars, I mean, at least Scaliger couldn't get his head around that. So when they compiled their own dictionaries, they followed an alphabetical order. But then you have a 16th century dictionary, which is quite later than the others, Nimetura of Sophia, and that was one of the most popular ones in Europe. It's a Persian-Turkish dictionary, and it actually has a European style. I mean, some of its recensions, especially those that were collected, I wonder if they commissioned some theists in the Ottoman Empire to compile it that way. I mean, frankly, I find it easier to follow as well if they go ABCD. But yes, the organization of dictionaries proved very, very tricky for some of the early Orientalists, although they should have been used to it. But yeah, so not every style was adopted. When it comes to commentaries, for instance, Sudi's commentaries on Philistan and so on, they were very, very influential. Whenever there was a European translation of Sadi's works, Bustan or Philistan, they would base their explanations without quoting Sudi on his commentaries. So there are other less obvious ways of following the trends and seeing how these cross-correlations, how these transfers of knowledge happen. So not always, but I think there was a very, very high percentage of methodologies that were lifted entirely from the Ottoman Empire and adopted, especially in the early years of Oriental studies. Perhaps not in the 19th century anymore.
Actually, it's in the 19th century, certainly in India.
Thank you for the insightful presentation. So it is indeed interesting to see that the Ottoman influence upon the Western world is higher than initially imagined. But personally, I couldn't rid myself of the impression that there was still a good amount of struggle from the Western scholars to actually access the Turkish texts. At least this is my personal impression at this point, and I was just, if this impression is indeed correct in some way, I was wondering if there's any way to unpack the reason behind this ongoing struggle, especially in the light of how this interaction was much smoother in the earlier periods, even in pre-Ottoman periods during the golden age of Islam through the House of Wisdom around the Baghdad school, where the bridge between Arabic and Latin through Greek language has been maybe relatively less of a struggle, whereas in a more recent period, it seems like that smoothness or that engagement has at least had some blow, it seems. First of all, am I right in this impression or not?
I'm not in a position to compare the golden age of Islam and the translations from Arabic through Greek into Latin. I don't know enough to conclude that it was not a struggle in that period. I know that there was a lot of texts that were translated, and it was a great influence of Islam, especially on Andalusia and so on. But I think you're right in this assumption that there was something rather unequal in terms of access to knowledge, because very few Ottomans in this Ottoman subjects in this period actually traveled to Europe from the Ottoman Empire. There were very few of them, and it was very difficult to find a Turkish teacher, a competent Turkish teacher in Europe to teach you. So the travel seems to occur from Europe into the Ottoman Empire, and that was a difficult passage. That was, full of dangers, barbaric pirates, and so on. It was a long way, it was a very expensive endeavor. So not everybody who wanted to read Turkish, for instance, William Shikar, who is now known as the inventor of the calculator, who was a Tübingen scholar. He wanted to learn Turkish. He never traveled to the Ottoman Empire. He tried to learn it through these printed grammars that I've shown you. He didn't succeed much. He didn't go very far. So there were economic, I think, reasons why Ottoman manuscripts were expensive and inaccessible, and teachers were not widely available in Europe. Very few Ottoman subjects, as I say, traveled, and those traveled. Turkish wasn't their first language. For instance, you know of Hakkari, for instance, who was fluent in Turkish, but his first language was Persian. He was one of the scribes of Golius, who lived in London together with Golius and helped him produce manuscripts and translate Persian texts into Latin. And he also worked in Turkish, but again, not a native speaker. So, and there is also the political climate. Each Turkish dictionary or any book about Turkey, any Turkish grammar that was printed in Europe would start with a dedication and a letter to the reader, as it was the custom of printed production. And they would always have this apologetic tone of, oh, I'm putting this into print, I'm publishing this, profanities, these, a book about Islam, a book about Turks. There was always that political, I think, danger of being involved in the circulation or proliferation or just the circulation of Turkish material in print in Europe. So that's another, I think, kind of concern. Whenever they are, for instance, a professor of Arabic is giving an oration on the importance of Arabic. It's always about, oh, there are our enemies, we can learn more about it. There's always like some sort of justification. You can't just learn Arabic for the sake of learning Arabic or for reading poetry and so on. That's why I was very surprised to find so much poetry being read and enjoyed, because it's never ever mentioned in printed sources. Nobody ever dares to say, well, I enjoyed a little bit of Baltimore court country. They were actually quite fun. So, I hope that was a good question.
Thank you very much again for this lovely presentation. I just wanted to ask you a very quick question. Was there, I imagine the answer is no, as also based from what you just said, now answering the previous question. But was there any kind of mirroring interest from the Ottoman side for the European languages and grammars, especially in the light of the fact that Italian, for example, was used as lingua franca by merchants, even if I know many of the merchants were mainly like Greeks or Jewish provenance, so they had some. But from the Ottoman side, was there any kind of interest? Or do you find, especially in this period, because I imagine after the 19th century, things changed dramatically. But yeah, that's...
Yeah, even in the 17th century, there were native Turkish speakers, not Greeks, not Jews, who would learn languages of the West, Greek, classical, ancient Greek mostly, but also Latin. There were also, I'm trying to remember the name of one of the authors that was collected, I think, by Golius. I think it was an astrological treatise, and this text was famous for its author, its Turkish author, being multilingual and being able to scar Western texts as well as Arabic and Persian. So there were certainly some figures, and these European travellers would go and find those figures who would speak languages because they really wanted to interact. And then there's the question of who was an Ottoman. Murat Bey, for instance, this inebriated court interpreter, he was captured he was of German origin, and he was brought to the Ottoman Empire as a teenager. And there's Palabıyık, for instance, I think the epitome of an Ottoman gentleman, but he was born in Poland to a Protestant family. So what is an Ottoman scholar?
11 times.
Is it somebody who was necessarily born in an Ottoman?
Yeah, that's
That's a great question. I was just wondering, was the Holy Grail, was the great prize for, let's say, a Western scholar to find an Ottoman grammar and then take that and translate it?
Why did that not happen? Yeah, I asked that question to myself. Maybe
If I was
we'll
doing it,
find
that's what I'd go and look for, yes?
They did collect Jaumi's grammar in Turkish, essentially the Turkish translations. So that was quite a popular work.
Any more questions? Oh, one at the back, yes?
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. My question is, with the scarcity of reliable printed materials, of lexicons and literary sources as well, I imagine that there's quite a lot of value in the manuscript sources that did end up in Europe. And I wondered, is there any evidence of manuscripts being loaned and borrowed between Oriental scholars, and also of manuscripts, especially with European annotations, being inherited by the next generation of Orientalists and even potentially copied out in full?
Yes, there are many instances of, just because a manuscript was a manuscript, it doesn't mean it was not in circulation. And manuscripts were sent between cities and between countries all the time. And a famous example of it is Scaliger's Achterli going to Vienna to Sebastian Teignagel, who was the librarian of the Imperial Palace, who was also a competent Orientalist who never wrote anything, he just read and entertained friends. But so Scaliger's dictionary ended up there and was copied by Teignagel's scribe, a man called Darish Ibrahim, a Turkish slave this time in Vienna. One of the very rare examples of a Turkish scribe not visiting but being captured and kept in Vienna. Another example is one of Boyus's, the Persian Turkish Latin dictionary of Boyus. It's very similar to Doysen's dictionary. It was sent to London to aid the production of a polyglot dictionary by Brian Walton. I always say Doysen's dictionary was never published, but actually it was through Boyus's copy sent to London and became part of a polyglot dictionary. I mean, it's very difficult to pick it apart to show which parts of it are coming from Doysen, but there are quite many instances of his verbatim translations from Nimetullah of Sophia appearing in a printed London edition decades later. So yeah, it's exactly the same Latin and just printed as it is in the 1623 manuscript that is in Munich. So yeah, they travel a lot and they influence each other. But sometimes it is difficult to unpick that direct influence. Because the cover of the book doesn't say, I took Doysen's dictionary, it's from Boyus, and so on and so forth. Yes,
what were the dragoman's role in this? Like when you were doing your research, did you find a lot of translations or like documents by dragomans?
Yes, Murat Bey was a dragoman, for instance, who translated these three Ottoman chronicles for Claudius. Another one was, again, Ayzufki, who translated the entire Bible into Turkish for the Dutch ambassador. So dragomans, especially when they were no longer working for the palace, because that was a job, they were willing to help some European visitors or ambassadors or diplomatic service, enter the diplomatic service in the, for the Dutch or the French for comfortable sum. But I think it was much more attracted to the employed by the something rather than the ambassadors. Because I don't know about the stories of ambassadors never getting an audience, waiting for months, and that sort of humiliation. People didn't suit their career aspirations. But they were, I think, very, very important in building these bridges, these linguistic bridges between. I try to focus more on text, but there's another scholar, Natalie Rothman, who wrote a book about the influence of dragomas in these cultural exchanges between Venice and the Ottoman.
Any more? No? Well, just leaves me to thank you very much for a very interesting